Hola! Welcome. My name is Erika Olmos and this is part 2 of the making of the purple embroidered purse. I hope you enjoy the process of the construction of this purse. Make sure to watch part 1 of this project if you haven't already. Let's begin. Okay, so I started by cutting out the embroidered pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around. I also cut out the interfacing out of a heavy sew-on stabilizer. These pieces were cut 1/8 of an inch smaller all around with no seam allowance. That way, when it's folded, the edges of the stabilizer should be flush to the sewing lines and no extra bulkiness is added. I pinned the stabilizer to the back of the embroidery pieces and began hand stitching all around the perimeter of the interfacing. I also made sure to sew along the areas where the purse is meant to fold, on the sides and the base of the purse. Here it's kind of difficult to tell, but I'm sewing along the fold lines of the base of the purse. These stitches on the fold lines just help make the interfacing and the embroidered pieces move as one. I'm following the same process for the side gussets. I'm sewing along the perimeter and along the lines where the purse will fold. Once done with that, I pinned the dart of the gusset closed and began by stitching the seam allowance flat to one side. This worked as a stay stitch when I began sewing along the actual sewing line to close the dart. This is how it looks once closed. There is no gap between the beaded sides, and that's my goal, to make it as seamless as possible. Here I'm folding down the seam allowance at the top of the gusset, stitching it down to prepare to sew it to the main piece. Throughout this process, you will see me jump around what I decide to sew next. Here I got too excited to put it all together, so I started working on the side of the main piece before working on the other gusset. Here I folded back the seam allowance, pinned it so that the beaded sides were flush to each other, and began stitching down the seam allowance flat to one side. And again, this works as a stay stitch, so it helps when I start sewing down the center sewing line to close the side. As I work on closing this seam, my goal once again is to make it look as seamless as possible. Here I'm closing the base of the side, and I switched up the style of my sewing a little. As you can see, I didn't pin any of the seam allowance down. I just started closing the base with invisible stitches. I eyeballed the seams to make sure they were matching correctly and closed the seam down. Now at this point, I stitched the seam allowance flat to one side. Here I'm working on the other side, closing the seams with invisible stitches first, then stitching the seam allowance flat to one side. There's really no right or wrong way to do this. There are many ways to the final destination, especially when hand sewing. Some choices make you work twice as hard. Some choices are shortcuts. At the end of the day, if your project holds up, doesn't fall apart, and is beautiful to you, that's all that matters. And a little about the finished embroidery design. I didn't know this would be the final design. I didn't know what it would look like until the very end actually. I started this project with a variety of beads and sequins and I just went with it. I didn't specifically plan to make it a floral, but I'm always drawn to florals in nature, so it makes sense how I ended up here. By the end of it, I had to decide what to do with the blank spaces in between all the florals, and I went for a paisley design. They are just easy and organic lines to draw on or sew on freehand. And with the colors, I ended up going with, I love the pink against the green and the effect that contrast created, making it look like a cotton candy sky kind of, and the lime and the green just gave the florals more life and texture. I don't know, I just loved the effects and I went with it. I loved what the contrast of the green did against the three different colors, the pink, the lime, and the violet blue. I really do love the design I ended up with. See? No rules on how to do things. Here I made it a little hard on myself, and I didn't even think about it until I had to. I should have closed the gusset dart first because it's easier to work on when it's not attached to the rest of the purse, but what's done is done. Just before I make it too hard on myself, I decided to close down the dart before I attach the gusset to the other side of the purse. Not gonna lie, the fact that I sewed the other side of the gusset without first hemming the top of the gusset is making me a little bit anxious watching it over. Luckily, I was smart enough to only sew up to the sewing line so I could fold the hem when I finally get to it. Finally, I'm getting closer to being done. Yay, I'm done. Just kidding. Just wanted to fit the frame to make sure everything was fitting all right. And now for the lining. I chose this bright pink fabric I had. I'm not sure of the content or the type of fabric, but I love the color for a lining. No need for hand sewing here. Here I'm sewing the gusset and snipping the corners as I get to the points so it's easy to turn. I'm also remembering to only sew up to the sewing line so it's easier when I'm attaching it to the finished purse. Now I'm top stitching or edge stitching so the seam allowance is flat to one side. Here I'm going to start attaching the lining to the purse, but I want to make sure to attach and secure the lining to the base and sides of the purse so the lining stays in place. And what I'm doing is only attaching seam allowance to seam allowance, so there is no tension on the seams. Nothing is sewn tight. The lining still sits nicely without any tension or pull. Just 2 stitches on each seam is enough. Now I can start pinning the lining in place to the hem of the purse, making sure everything fits nicely. Here I'm sewing the lining to the purse, but not being too perfect on the front and the back since the frame hides the stitches, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But when it comes to the sides, I do attach the lining with invisible stitches to have a cleaner look. Yay, I'm almost done. I used a small amount of glue on the frame and I'm finally attaching the frame to the purse. The interfacing on the inside of the purse gives it a good snug fit, and I used an awl to gently push the corners up into the frame and let it dry upside down for at least 12 hours. Here it is, all done. The process of making this purse was really fun. I hope you guys loved watching the process. Thank you for watching if you watched all the way. Really appreciate it. Thank you.